Imagine a test you cannot win, a scenario designed to challenge your character, not your skills. This is the Kobayashi Maru, Starfleet's ultimate ethical dilemma. But what if theology had its own no-win scenarios? What if the deepest mysteries of faith mirrored the impossible choices of the Kobayashi Maru? The problem of evil, divine foreknowledge versus human freedom, paradoxes that defy logic. And yet, they are not meant to be solved, but to transform us. Some theologians rewrite the rules, others embrace the paradox, and a few leap in faith beyond reason. Discover the power of the impossible in theology. Read The Kobayashi Maru Paradox, a journey into the heart of spiritual dilemmas.
We're exploring this whole idea of impossible situations, these unsolvable dilemmas, and we're going to do it by looking at this, well, primarily surprising connection between a classic sci-fi setup and some really deep theological questions.
Exactly. And, for everyone listening, we know you're curious, you want to get these complex ideas, but maybe without getting totally bogged down.
Right.
So think of this as a kind of shortcut, a way into this really cool intersection of pop culture and heavy philosophy.
So our mission today, it's pretty straightforward, but hopefully really illuminating. We want to unpack the structure, but also the value, maybe, of these dilemmas that seem impossible to solve.
The inherent value.
And we'll do that by comparing the Kobayashi Maru test from Star Trek,
a classic,
with these big theological paradoxes, like the problem of evil, free will, all that stuff. We've got some really interesting source material on this.
You do.
And we're going to pull out the most important insights. Okay, so where do we start? Starfleet Academy.
Let's beam aboard, right? The Kobayashi Maru, for anyone maybe not deep into Trek lore, it's this training simulation at Starfleet Academy.
But not just any simulation, right?
No, not at all. The key thing, the thing that makes it famous, is that it's specifically designed to be a no-win scenario. It's unwinnable by design.
It's rigged from the start. So what's the setup?
Okay, so the basics are a civilian ship, the Kobayashi Maru, is in distress, sends out an SOS, but it's inside the Klingon neutral zone.
Uh-oh. Treaty violation territory.
Exactly. So you're the cadet in the captain's chair. What do? Try to rescue them. That means crossing into the neutral zone, violating the treaty, probably starting a fight with the Klingons, maybe even war.
Okay, that sounds bad. What's the alternative?
The alternative is you follow the rules. You stay out of the neutral zone. And you leave the Kobayashi Maru and its crew to, well, probably die.
Oof. So either risk war or abandon people in need.
Precisely. Either choice leads to a negative outcome. Break the treaty, you likely face overwhelming force. Stick to the treaty, you fail a fundamental duty.
So the test isn't about finding the clever tactical solution.
Not at all. It's about how you face the unwinnable. What does it reveal about your character under that kind of pressure?
It's a brutal test. And yeah, the key is just there's no right answer that lets you come out clean. You fail either way by some measure.
You either break Starfleet regs with huge consequences or you fail morally. It's that impossibility that makes it such a powerful concept.
Who came up with this thing?
It was screenwriter Jack B. Sowards. Introduced it back in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Khan, of course.
And it pops up again and again in Star Trek because it's such a useful device for exploring character, leadership, ethics under fire.
Okay. So we've got this deliberately impossible test in Starfleet. Now, link it up for us. How does this connect to theology?
Right. Here's the fascinating jump. That very structure, the Kobayashi Maru framework, it mirrors, quite strikingly, some of the most profound, most difficult questions theology has wrestled with for centuries.
You mean the theology has its own no-win scenarios?
In a manner of speaking, yes. You can see a similar kind of structure, a moral or conceptual choice.
Okay.
Options that seem mutually exclusive, and both seem to lead to, well, negative theological consequences, or at least deep, deep problems.
And no easy resolution.
And often no truly satisfying resolution within this standard theological framework. It really highlights these apparent clashes between core beliefs and, the way things are.
Okay, I need an example. Give me a theological Kobayashi Maru.
The problem of theodicy. That's probably the biggest, most famous one.
Right, theodicy. That's trying to square God's existence with all the evil and suffering in the world.
Exactly. How do you reconcile a God who is supposed to be all-powerful, omnipotent,
all-knowing, omniscient.
and perfectly good, omnibenevolent.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that God with the sheer amount of horrific suffering and evil we see?
Yeah, the classic, if God is good and powerful, why do bad things happen?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the philosopher J.L. Mackie really laid this out starkly. He called it the omnipotence paradox, basically.
Okay.
He pointed out the logical contradiction. If God can stop evil, knows about all evil, and wants to stop evil because he's perfectly good, then why doesn't he? Why does evil still exist?
It really does make you stop and think, because if you chip away at any of those attributes, the power, the knowledge, the goodness, it changes everything about how you understand God.
It does.
Yeah.
And someone like Marilyn McCord Adams took it even further, pointing out that for some truly horrendous evils, it's not just that we don't understand God's reasons.
Yeah.
It's that we can't even imagine a reason that would make sense, that would still allow for a worthwhile life for the person suffering so terribly.
Wow. That feels like hitting a wall.
It is. It's that feeling of an insurmountable obstacle. And this problem, theodicy, it's not new.
Yeah.
It's been debated and wrestled with by theologians and philosophers for thousands of years. It persists.
Okay, so theodicy is definitely a Kobayashi Maru. Feels impossible. What's another big one?
Another major one is the whole dilemma around free will and predestination, or divine foreknowledge.
Ah, right. If God knows everything that's going to happen, do we actually have free will?
That's the core tension.
Yeah.
It's been a source of huge debates. Walk through the logic. If God is genuinely omniscient, all-knowing,
Okay.
then he has to know in advance every single choice every person will ever make.
Right. Logically, yeah, because he's all-knowing.
If God already knows what I'm going to choose tomorrow before I choose it, in what sense is my choice actually free when I make it? Isn't it already somehow fixed?
Predetermined. And then if it's predetermined, how can I be held morally responsible for it if I couldn't have chosen otherwise?
Exactly. See the cascade? It seems to undermine free will and therefore moral responsibility.
It feels like another trap.
It does. And this tension fueled massive arguments throughout history. You had figures like Augustine and Pelagius debating it early on. Then later, the huge split between Calvinists and Arminians during the Reformation was heavily centered on this.
Wow. So this isn't just an abstract puzzle.
Not at all. It have huge implications. And again, like the Kobayashi Maru, trying to fully resolve it within traditional frameworks often seems to push you into uncomfortable territory. You either seem to limit God's knowledge or limit human freedom.
Okay, so we've got these really tough, maybe impossible theological dilemmas. Now, back in Star Trek, Kirk famously beat the Kobayashi Maru, but how?
Ah, yes. Cadet Kirk. He didn't solve the simulation as presented.
Right, he cheated.
He reprogrammed it. He changed the conditions of the test so that it was winnable.
Okay, so have theologians tried something similar? Kind of, reprogramming the core concepts to make the dilemmas resolvable.
Absolutely. That's a great parallel.
Yeah.
You see theological movements that attempt to address these paradoxes by essentially modifying or reinterpreting one of the core divine attributes that creates the tension.
Like what?
Well, take open theism, for example. Thinkers like Clark Pinnock and others suggested that maybe God's omniscience doesn't mean knowing the future choices of free creatures with absolute certainty.
So God knows everything that can be known, but future free choices aren't fixed yet, so even God doesn't know them for sure.
Kind of like that, yeah. They argue God knows all possibilities, but our free choices bring one of those possibilities into reality. It preserves genuine freedom by slightly redefining omniscience.
Okay, that's one approach. Any others?
Then there's process theology, linked with thinkers like Whitehead, Hartshorne, Griffin. They often tackle the problem of evil by rethinking divine omnipotence.
Yes.
Instead of a God with absolute coercive power who controls everything, they propose a God who works with the world through persuasion and influence. God experiences the world along with us and guides it towards good, but doesn't unilaterally prevent all evil, because that would override the world's own freedom and processes.
So God's power is more like influence than absolute control. Less cosmic dictator, more cosmic persuader.
That's a decent way to put it. God is deeply involved, but doesn't micromanage or override creaturely freedom.
So these are definitely attempts to find a way out by adjusting the definitions. But like Kirk getting called out for cheating,
Yeah.
Are these widely accepted solutions?
Well, that's the thing. As the author of our source material notes, while these are significant theological movements, they aren't necessarily seen as solutions by everyone, especially within more traditional circles.
Why not?
Because modifying concepts like omniscience or omnipotence inevitably raises other theological questions. For some, it feels like diminishing God's essential nature to solve a logical problem, so they often remain controversial.
Okay, so if changing the rules isn't the universally accepted answer, what's left? Just live with the paradox.
That leads us to another really profound approach, which is, in fact, to embrace the paradox itself. To see the irresolvability not as a failure, but as pointing to something important.
How does that work?
Think about epiphatic theology, sometimes called negative theology. It's really central in, say, the Eastern Orthodox tradition.
Negative theology.
Yeah, instead of trying to say what God is using positive terms, God is good, God is wise, it focuses on what God is not. God is not finite, God is not comprehensible, God is not limited.
So it emphasizes the limits of our understanding.
Exactly. It's a conscious recognition that human language and concepts ultimately fall short when trying to describe the divine mystery. Pseudo-Dionysius, a key figure here, talked about how the higher we try to ascend towards understanding God, the more our words fail us.
So in this view, the value of the dilemma isn't finding the answer.
But the process of grappling with it, the dilemma itself becomes transformative. It reveals the limits of our reason when faced with something truly transcendent.
So accepting the paradox isn't giving up, it's a different kind of understanding.
You could say that. It's positioning the acceptance of paradox not as a failure of rationality, but maybe at a higher form of knowledge, one that acknowledges its own boundaries before the immensity of the divine.
Okay, that's a big shift. The
Right.
paradox itself becomes the lesson.
Precisely. Which brings up really interesting questions about knowledge itself, epistemology. If these theological paradoxes are, maybe, structurally unsolvable for us, what's their cognitive value? What do we actually learn from them?
Right, if we can't solve them, what's the point of wrestling with them? Are they just brain teasers?
Well, one perspective, maybe drawing from someone like Wittgenstein, is that they show us the limits of language. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. They mark the boundary.
Right.
But our sources also emphasize a formative aspect. These paradoxes act like spiritual exercises.
Spiritual exercises, like mental gym for the soul.
Kind of. They push our understanding to its absolute limit, and in doing so, they can shape our inner disposition, our humility, our orientation towards mystery.
Can you give examples of that kind of thing?
Sure. Think about rabbinic interpretation, midrash, which often holds multiple, sometimes conflicting readings in tension, or Ignatian spirituality with its imaginative contemplation, or even Zenko in sense, those riddles designed not for a logical answer, but to provoke a shift in consciousness.
Ah, right. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping?
Exactly. Caroline Franks Davis argued that this encounter with paradox is central to religious, knowing it can lead to a kind of knowledge that isn't just about facts or propositions, but is deeper, more experiential.
And that feels really relevant today, doesn't it? In a world with so many different beliefs colliding.
Absolutely. In theology, dealing with religious pluralism, acknowledging the paradoxes within one's own tradition fosters what's called epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility, meaning knowing that you don't know everything?
Basically, yes. Recognize the limits of your own perspective and understanding, and that humility is crucial for genuine dialogue between different faiths. If you accept mystery in your own tradition, maybe you're more open to the truths others hold.
Okay, this is fascinating. Now, you hinted earlier, connections to science. How does quantum physics fit into this?
Yeah, this is another really interesting parallel. Modern physics, especially quantum mechanics, is full of its own paradoxes and seemingly contradictory ideas.
Really? Like what?
Well, take Bohr's principle of complementarity. It says that something like light behaves both as a wave and as a particle.
But those seem like opposites.
They do. Yet physics accepts both descriptions as true and necessary, depending on how you measure it, or Heisenberg's uncertain principle.
Right, the one that says you can't know both the exact position and momentum of a particle at the same time.
Exactly. And it's not just that our tools aren't good enough. It seems to be a fundamental limit built into reality itself at that scale. Reality is fuzzy, probabilistic.
So science itself embraces things that seem logically contradictory or fundamentally unknowable.
At the quantum level, yes. And this gives some support to the idea we discussed in theology, accepting paradox. Maybe these deep puzzles aren't just failures of our logic, but reflect something fundamental about reality itself, whether physical or divine.
Could this change how we think about God's knowledge, for instance? That omniscience idea?
Potentially. Some have suggested rethinking omniscience in light of quantum indeterminacy. Maybe God doesn't know the fixed future state of every particle because it isn't fixed. Maybe God knows all the possibilities and their probabilities perfectly.
So God knows the quantum wave function of the universe, so to speak, all the potentialities.
That's one way to think about it, perhaps. It shifts the picture from a God knowing a predetermined script to a God knowing an evolving reality with all its inherent possibilities.
Wow.
The big takeaway here is that both science and theology, when they push to the very edges of understanding, encounter paradox. And maybe embracing that paradox is necessary for deeper insight.
This has been, really mind-expanding. Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. As we wrap up, what's the main thing listeners should take away from this deep dive into the Kobayashi Maru and theology?
I think the core insight, really, is that the value of these seemingly impossible dilemmas, whether in Star Trek or in theology, might not be in solving them.
Not finding the answer.
Right. The real value might lie in the journey itself, the act of grappling with them, wrestling with the complexity, and what that reveals to us about the limits of our own understanding.
It really brings it back to the Kobayashi Maru not being a test of tactics, but a test of character. How do you react when faced with the unwinnable?
Exactly. And maybe these big theological paradoxes function similarly. They test our attitude towards mystery, our willingness to accept limits, our capacity for humility before the really big questions.
So a final thought maybe for everyone listening. Think about the dilemmas in your own life, the things that feel unsolvable. Instead of just getting frustrated trying to find the perfect fix, maybe ask, what can I learn from just engaging with this, from exploring its complexity, even if the answer isn't clear?
What insights about yourself or the situation or just the limits of knowing can come from wrestling with the seemingly unresolvable?
Yeah, it's a different way to approach problems.
It is. And hey, if any of this sparked more curiosity, epiphatic theology, process thought, free will debates, definitely dig deeper. There's a whole universe of thought out there to explore.